Hashtag the clockmaker's daughter. Hashtag part 1. The inheritance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of my apartment like a whisper from another world. I found it there when I stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed and running late for work, nearly stepping on the cream-colored envelope that bore no return address and smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I didn't open it right away. There was coffee to make, emails to answer, the familiar rhythm of a life lived in careful routine. But the envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a question mark, patient and persistent, until finally, during my lunch break, I sliced it open with a butter knife. Dear Miss Evelyn Thorne, it is with great regret that we must inform you of the passing of your great-aunt Josephine Thorne on the 15th of October. As her sole surviving relative and named beneficiary, you are hereby summoned to the reading of her will at the offices of Blackwood & Sons, solicitors in the village of Ashford-on-Sea, at your earliest convenience. Please contact us to arrange a suitable appointment. Yours faithfully, Edmund Blackwood, Esq. I read the letter 3 times, each word sinking in like stones dropped into still water. Great-Aunt Josephine. I had only the vaguest memory of her. A tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who had visited once when I was very young, bringing with her a music box that played a haunting melody I could no longer quite recall. My mother had spoken of her rarely, and always with a mixture of affection and something else I couldn't name. Distance, perhaps, or fear. I hadn't known she'd died. I hadn't known she'd remembered me. 2 weeks later, I found myself on a train heading north, watching the city give way to countryside, the landscape rolling past in shades of autumn gold and fading green. Ashford-on-Sea was a village I'd never visited, tucked away on the coast where the cliffs met the water in a dramatic collision of stone and spray. The train station was small and old-fashioned, with hanging baskets of late-blooming flowers and a single taxi waiting by the curb. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, nodded when I gave him the address of the solicitor's office. "Knew Miss Thorne, did you?" he asked as we wound through narrow streets lined with stone cottages. "Not well," I admitted. "She was my great-aunt." "Ah." He nodded sagely. "She was a fine woman, kept to herself mostly up there in that old house. But she had a way about her, like she knew things the rest of us didn't." The solicitor's office was located above a bookshop in the village center, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked with each step. Edmund Blackwood was a man in his 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and spectacles that perched on the end of his nose. He shook my hand with surprising warmth. "Miss Thorne, thank you for making the journey. Please sit." His office was cluttered with papers and leather-bound books, smelling of dust and old leather. He settled behind his desk and pulled out a file. "Your great-aunt was quite specific in her instructions," he began. "She left you her entire estate, the house, its contents, and a rather substantial sum of money. There is, however, one condition." I leaned forward. "What condition?" "You must live in the house for at least 1 year before you can sell it or dispose of its contents." She was quite adamant about this. "If you refuse, the estate passes to a historical society." I sat back, processing this. "Why?" Mr. Blackwood smiled slightly. "She said you would ask that. I'm afraid I don't have an answer. Your great-aunt was, let us say, particular in her ways, but she believed you needed to spend time in that house. She said it was important that you understand the family legacy." "What legacy?" "That I cannot tell you. She never elaborated." He pushed a set of keys across the desk. "The house is called Thornhaven. It's about 2 miles north of the village, on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, still maintains it. She's been informed of your arrival." I picked up the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. They were old-fashioned, made of brass that had been polished to a soft shine. "When did she die?" I asked quietly. 3 months ago. She was found in her workshop. She had a heart attack, they said. Quite sudden. She was 93, but sharp as ever right up to the end. Her workshop. She was a clockmaker, Miss Thorne, quite renowned in certain circles. Did you not know? I shook my head slowly. Another thing my mother had never mentioned. The road to Thornhaven wound along the coast, offering glimpses of the sea through breaks in the stone walls that lined the route. The taxi driver, his name was Thomas, he told me, pointed out various landmarks. The old church with its Norman tower, the harbor where fishing boats still came and went, the ruins of an abbey on a distant hill. But my attention was fixed on what lay ahead, on the house that appeared as we rounded a final curve. Thornhaven sat on a promontory of land jutting out toward the sea, a Victorian mansion of dark stone with tall windows that caught the afternoon light. It was larger than I'd expected, 3 stories high with a tower on one corner and ivy climbing the walls. The gardens were overgrown but had clearly once been magnificent, and a gravel drive led to a heavy oak door. "Here we are," Thomas said, pulling to a stop. "I'll help you with your bags." As I stepped out of the car, the wind hit me, sharp and salt-laden, carrying with it the crash of waves against the cliffs below. The house loomed above, and for a moment, I felt a strange reluctance, as if crossing that threshold would change something fundamental about my life. "Thank you," I said, paying Thomas and adding a generous tip. "You need anything, you call the taxi stand. Ask for me personal, if you like." He hesitated. "Place can feel lonely out here, especially when the winter comes." I nodded, shouldering my overnight bag and rolling my suitcase toward the door. Behind me, I heard the taxi pull away, the sound of its engine fading until there was nothing but the wind and the sea and the beating of my own heart. The door opened before I could use the keys. "Miss Evelyn, we've been expecting you." The woman who stood there was in her 70s, I guessed, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a simple dress and cardigan, and her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between welcoming and wary. "Mrs. Crawford?" "That's right. Come in, come in. Don't want to let all the heat out." I stepped into a grand entrance hall that took my breath away. The floor was black and white marble in a checkerboard pattern, and a sweeping staircase curved upward to the floors above. But what caught my eye was the sound, a soft, constant ticking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Clocks. There were clocks everywhere. They lined the walls and sat on every available surface. Grandfather clocks and carriage clocks, wall clocks and mantel clocks, each one ticking away in its own rhythm, creating a symphony of temporal passage that was both beautiful and slightly overwhelming. "Your great-aunt's collection," Mrs. Crawford said, following my gaze. "She made most of them herself. Over 70 years of work, it is." I turned slowly, taking it all in. The clocks were exquisite, each one unique. I spotted a clock shaped like a ship in full sail, another that seemed to be made entirely of glass gears that turned and meshed in hypnotic patterns, a third that showed not just the time but the phases of the moon and the positions of the planets. "They're extraordinary," I breathed. "That they are." Mrs. Crawford picked up my suitcase. "Come on, I'll show you to your room. You must be tired from your journey." She led me up the stairs and down a hallway lined with portraits. Ancestors, I assumed, though I recognized none of them. My room was at the front of the house, overlooking the sea, with a 4-poster bed and furniture that looked Victorian but was surprisingly comfortable. "I've made up the bed with fresh linens," Mrs. Crawford said. "Supper will be at 6, if that suits you. I've kept things simple. Just me here to look after the place, so it's nothing fancy. That's perfectly fine. Thank you. She paused in the doorway. Your great aunt. She was very fond of you, you know, even though you never visited. She kept track of you over the years. Had me send birthday cards on her behalf. I felt a pang of guilt. I'd never responded to those cards. Had barely noticed them among the usual greetings from distant relatives and family friends. I didn't know her well, I said quietly.
No.
Well, perhaps that will change. Mrs. Crawford's expression softened slightly. She left something for you in the workshop. Said you were to see it when you were ready, not before. What is it? Her final clock. She called it her masterpiece. But she never finished it. Mrs. Crawford's eyes grew distant. She said only you could complete it. Before I could ask what she meant, the housekeeper had turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my questions and the endless ticking of the clocks. ## part 2. The workshop. I spent the first few days simply exploring the house, trying to make sense of the space that was now, temporarily at least, my home. Thornhaven was vast, with rooms I couldn't imagine ever using. A formal dining room that could seat 20, a library that rivaled some university collections, a conservatory filled with plants that Mrs. Crawford tended with obvious care. But it was the clocks that drew me back again and again. They were everywhere, and each one was a marvel. I found myself stopping to examine them, to watch the intricate dance of gears and springs, to listen to the various chimes that marked the passing hours. Some were traditional, their mechanisms familiar from antique shops and museums. But others were strange, almost unsettling in their complexity. There was a clock in the library that showed different times depending on where you stood when you looked at it. Another in the morning room that seemed to tick backward for exactly 3 seconds every hour. And in the master bedroom, Great Aunt Josephine's room, which I couldn't quite bring myself to enter. There was a clock that made no sound at all, but whose hands moved with such perfect smoothness that watching them was almost hypnotic. On the third evening, over a simple supper of soup and bread, I asked Mrs. Crawford about the workshop. I'd like to see it, I said. The place where she worked. The housekeeper's hands stilled on her teacup. Are you sure you're ready? I don't know what I'm supposed to be ready for, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. Everyone keeps speaking in riddles. Mr. Blackwood, you, even that letter. What was she trying to tell me? Mrs. Crawford studied me for a long moment. Your great aunt believed in legacy, in passing down knowledge, skill, understanding. She was the last of a line of clockmakers that stretched back nearly 300 years. And she believed that you, she paused. She believed you had the gift. What gift? I don't know anything about clockmaking. Not that kind of gift. Mrs. Crawford rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Have you ever felt like time moves differently for you? Like sometimes it slows down or speeds up, like you can sense the rhythm of the world in a way others can't. I started to deny it, then stopped, because I had felt that sometimes. Moments when time seemed to stretch like taffy, when I could see the trajectory of a falling object with perfect clarity, when I knew, just knew, exactly how long something would take or when something was about to happen. I'd always dismissed it as coincidence, as pattern recognition, as nothing more than being observant. The Thornes, Mrs. Crawford continued, have always been more than clockmakers. They were timekeepers in a deeper sense. They understood time as something more than just measurement. Your great aunt wanted you to know that, to understand what you're capable of. That's impossible, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The workshop is in the West Tower, top floor. I'll take you there tomorrow if you like, when the light is good. She turned back to face me. But I warn you, what you find there might change how you see the world. Once you step through that door, there's no going back to easy ignorance. I barely slept that night. The clocks seemed louder in the darkness, their ticking marking out seconds and minutes and hours with relentless precision. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Crawford had said, about gifts and legacies and the impossible notion that time could be anything other than what physics and common sense said it was. When dawn finally came, I was already dressed and waiting. Mrs. Crawford led me through the house to a door I'd noticed but not yet opened. A heavy oak door bound with iron, with a lock that required one of the brass keys Mr. Blackwood had given me. This was her private space, Mrs. Crawford said as I turned the key. No one was allowed in without her permission, not even me, except to clean once a month, and only when she was present. The door swung open to reveal a spiral staircase climbing up into shadow. Mrs. Crawford flicked a switch, and electric lights flickered to life, showing worn stone steps that curved upward. We climbed in silence, around and around, until I was dizzy and breathless, until finally we emerged into the tower room. And I stopped, stunned into silence. The workshop was circular, following the tower's shape, with tall windows on all sides offering views of the sea, the cliffs, the sky. But the room itself was what took my breath away. Every surface was covered with tools, components, drawings, plans. Workbenches lined the walls, each one devoted to a different stage of clockmaking. Here, tiny gears laid out in precise rows. There, springs of various sizes coiled like sleeping serpents. In the corner, sheets of brass waiting to be cut and shaped. Cabinets with hundreds of small drawers stood like sentinels, each drawer labeled in precise handwriting. And hanging from the ceiling on nearly invisible wires were what looked like dozens of pendulums, swaying gently in the air currents. But dominating the center of the room, sitting on a massive workbench of its own, was the clock. I moved toward it slowly, drawn by something I couldn't name. It was unlike any clock I'd ever seen. The case was made of what looked like crystal or glass, perfectly clear, so that all the inner workings were visible. But the mechanisms inside were impossibly complex. Gears within gears, wheels that seemed to rotate in multiple dimensions, pendulums that swung in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. And it was incomplete. I could see the gaps, the places where components were missing, where the design on the plans scattered around it didn't match what had been built. She worked on this for 20 years, Mrs. Crawford said softly. Called it the Temporal Symphony. Said it was her attempt to map time itself, to capture not just its passage but its nature, its flow, its flexibility. I reached out, my fingers stopping just short of touching the crystal case. What does it do? I don't know. She never finished it, never wound it, said it wasn't ready. Mrs. Crawford moved to one of the workbenches and picked up a leather-bound journal. But she left you these, her notes, her theories, her instructions. And she left you this. She held out a letter, sealed with red wax bearing the imprint of a clock. I took it with trembling hands and broke the seal. My dear Evelyn, asterisk if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way to my workshop. Good. You've taken the first step toward understanding who you are and what you're capable of. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know we barely knew each other. Your mother chose to leave this life behind, to pretend our family's gift didn't exist. I respected her choice, though it saddened me. But I always knew that the gift had passed to you. I could sense it, even when you were just a child, that sensitivity to temporal currents that marks our bloodline. Asterisk. Asterisk, the clock before you is my life's work, but it cannot be completed by my hands alone. Each generation of our family has added to it, building on the work of those who came before. Your great-great-grandfather designed the core mechanism. Your great-grandmother added the temporal regulators. I've spent my life working on the harmonic resonators. But the final piece, the component that will allow it to truly function, can only be made by you. Asterisk. Asterisk in my journals, you'll find everything you need to know about clockmaking, about our family's true work, about the nature of time itself. Study them, learn, and when you're ready, when you understand what must be done, complete the Temporal Symphony. Asterisk. Asterisk, but be warned. This clock is not just a timepiece. It is a tool, a lens through which the true nature of time can be observed and, perhaps, influenced. In the wrong hands, it could be dangerous. In the right hands, yours, it could change everything. Asterisk. Asterisk, trust your instincts. Trust the gift you were born with. And above all, trust that you are capable of more than you ever imagined. Asterisk. With love and hope, Josephine. I read the letter twice, 3 times, each word sinking in like drops of water into parched earth. Then I looked up at Mrs. Crawford, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You knew about this, I said. I knew she was planning to leave it to you. I didn't know what it was she wanted you to do. I turned back to the clock, to the Temporal Symphony with all its impossible complexity. I don't know how to make clocks. Then you'll have to learn. Mrs. Crawford moved toward the door. I'll leave you to it. Take your time. The house will be here when you're ready to come down. And then I was alone with the clocks and the journals and a destiny I'd never asked for. Hashtag part 3. The education. I started with the basics. Great Aunt Josephine's journals were numerous, dozens of leather-bound volumes, each one filled with her precise, careful handwriting. The earliest dated back to when she was just 16, an apprentice to her own father, learning the fundamental principles of the craft. I read them chronologically, starting from the beginning, and slowly a picture emerged of not just how to make clocks, but why. The Thorne family had been clockmakers for generations, but they'd also been something more. Scholars of time itself, explorers of a frontier that most people didn't even know existed. The journal spoke of time not as a constant, uniform flow, but as something more complex, a river with currents and eddies, with shallows and depths, with places where it moved faster or slower depending on circumstances that had nothing to do with physics as I understood it. And more than that, they spoke of people like me, like Josephine, like all the Thornes stretching back through history, who could sense these variations, who could feel the texture of time itself. I thought they were mad at first, brilliant but deluded, mistaking coincidence and intuition for something supernatural. But then I started to pay attention to my own experiences, to the moments I'd always dismissed as nothing special. And I began to notice patterns. When I worked in the tower, time moved differently. Hours would pass like minutes when I was absorbed in studying the journals or examining the components of the Temporal Symphony. But then I'd glance at my watch and find that only 20 minutes had elapsed when it felt like I'd been reading for 2 hours. At first, I blamed distraction, the way time seems to compress when you're focused. But then I started experimenting, deliberately trying to notice the sensation when it happened. And I realized I could feel it, a kind of thickness to the air, a subtle resistance like moving through water instead of air. Mrs. Crawford noticed my absorption. She brought meals to the tower on a tray, left them without comment when she saw I was working. She answered my questions when I had them, about Josephine's habits, about the house, about the village and its history. But mostly she left me alone, understanding, perhaps, that this was something I needed to discover for myself. Weeks passed. October turned to November, and the weather grew colder, the winds off the sea more fierce. I barely noticed. I was learning a new language, a new way of seeing the world, and it consumed me entirely. I started with simple projects, following Josephine's instructions for beginning clockmakers. I learned to cut gears from sheets of brass, to file them until their teeth meshed perfectly. I learned to coil springs with exactly the right tension to calculate gear ratios and escapement angles. My first attempts were clumsy, laughable even, but I persisted, and slowly my hands learned what my mind was teaching them. And all the while I studied the Temporal Symphony, trying to understand its design, its purpose, the gaps that needed to be filled. I gradually came to understand not just a clock but a model, a three-dimensional representation of time's true nature. The gears didn't just turn. They represented different temporal flows, different scales of time, from the flutter of a hummingbird's wings to the slow dance of galaxies. The crystal case wasn't just for show. It was a lens, ground and polished to specific curvatures that Josephine's notes suggested could actually slow or focus temporal energy. Temporal energy. I still struggled with the concept, with the idea that time was something that could be manipulated like light or sound. But the journals were insistent, backed up by centuries of observation and experimentation by the Thorne family. And then, one evening in late November, I had my first undeniable experience. I was working on a particularly tricky component, a harmonic oscillator that needed to vibrate at a precise frequency. I'd been at it for hours, filing and adjusting, checking and rechecking, when suddenly everything just clicked. The piece fit perfectly into its mounting, and when I tapped it gently with a tiny hammer, it rang like a bell, a pure, clear note that seemed to hang in the air forever. And as I listened to that note, I felt time slow. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of being focused or absorbed, actually slow. I watched a mote of dust drift through a beam of afternoon light, and I could see it pause, reverse, pause again, as if it couldn't decide which direction to go. I turned my head, and the motion took ages, my muscles moving through some thick, invisible medium. I tried to speak, and my voice came out so low and drawn out that it was barely recognizable. And then the note faded, and time snapped back to normal speed with an almost physical jolt that left me gasping. I sat down hard on the floor, my heart hammering, my hands shaking. It was real. All of it was real. The gift, the sensitivity to time, the possibility of seeing and experiencing time as something fluid rather than fixed. It wasn't delusion or family legend. It was real, and I had it, and I'd just proven it beyond any doubt. I started laughing, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the tower, tears streaming down my face. Relief and wonder and terror all mixed together. Because if this was real, then what else was possible? What else had I dismissed as impossible that might actually be within reach? I picked up Josephine's journal and began to read with new eyes, no longer skeptical but hungry, eager to learn everything she had to teach me. The winter deepened. Snow fell, blanketing the clifftops and turning Thornhaven into something from a fairy tale. Mrs. Crawford taught me to tend the fireplaces, to keep the house warm against the bitter cold. I made regular trips to the village for supplies, gradually becoming a familiar sight at the local shops. The villagers were curious about me but respectful of my privacy. They'd known Josephine for decades, had mourned her passing, and they seemed willing to give her great niece the benefit of the doubt. I'd nod to them on the street, exchange pleasantries at the post office, occasionally stop for tea at the small cafe near the harbor. But mostly I lived in the tower, in the world of gears and springs and temporal theory. I made my second clock in December, a simple mantel clock with a brass case and a pendulum that swung with perfect regularity. It kept time accurately to within a second per week, which Josephine's notes told me was respectable for a beginner. I placed it in my bedroom, and the sound of its ticking became a comfort, a reminder of what I was learning, what I was becoming. My third clock was more ambitious, a carriage clock with multiple complications showing not just the hour and minute, but the day of the week and the phase of the moon. It took me 3 weeks to complete, working late into the nights, often falling asleep at the workbench only to wake with stiff muscles and a crick in my neck. But when I wound it and set it running, when I watched all those tiny gears mesh and turn, all those hands moving in their predetermined paths, I felt a surge of pride unlike anything I'd experienced before. I'd made this. With my own hands and my growing understanding, I'd created something beautiful and functional and precise. I was becoming a clockmaker, a real one. But more than that, I was beginning to understand time itself. The journal spoke of temporal nodes, places where time naturally pooled or flowed more strongly. They spoke of chronoception, the ability to sense time's passage without reference to external markers. They spoke of temporal resonance, the way certain frequencies could influence time's flow, speeding it or slowing it by tiny fractions. And they spoke of the Temporal Symphony's true purpose, to create a temporal field so precisely controlled, so perfectly tuned, that within its influence, time itself could be observed in its raw state, stripped of the illusions that normally obscured it. What that meant exactly, I still didn't fully understand. But I knew I was getting closer to finding out. Christmas came and went quietly. Mrs. Crawford put up a small tree in the parlor, and we exchanged simple gifts. I gave her a beautiful shawl I'd found in the village. She gave me a set of precision screwdrivers that had belonged to Josephine. We had dinner together, roast chicken and all the trimmings, and for a few hours the house felt less like a museum and more like a home. "You're doing well," Mrs. Crawford said over dessert. "Your great-aunt would be proud." "I still don't understand everything," I admitted. Some of her later journals, the theories get so complex, so abstract. I'm not sure I'll ever fully grasp what she was trying to do. "Perhaps you're not meant to grasp it intellectually," Mrs. Crawford suggested. "Perhaps it's something you have to feel, to experience." The Thornes always said their gift was as much art as science. I nodded slowly, thinking of that moment when time had slowed, when I'd felt its texture change around me. "How much did you know about all of this?" "Enough. I've worked here for 40 years, Miss Evelyn. You can't spend that much time around someone like your great-aunt without picking up a few things. I've never had the gift myself, not like you or her, but I've seen enough to know it's real." "Did she—" I hesitated. "Did she ever change things? With her clocks?" Mrs. Crawford's expression grew guarded. "That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself. When you complete the Temporal Symphony. When you understand what it can do. But I'll tell you this, your great-aunt was a good woman. Whatever she did, whatever she might have been capable of, she never used her gift for harm. She believed in the sanctity of time, in the necessity of letting things unfold as they must. The Temporal Symphony wasn't built to change time, Miss Evelyn. It was built to understand it. The new year arrived with storms that battered the coast, waves crashing against the cliffs below Thornhaven with such force that the house itself seemed to tremble. I watched from the tower windows as the sea raged, as rain lashed the glass, and I felt a strange kinship with the elements, with forces beyond human control but not beyond human understanding. By February, I'd made a dozen clocks, each one more complex than the last. My hands had grown steady, my eye for precision sharpened. I could look at a gear and know if it was cut correctly, could feel the tension in a spring and know if it needed adjusting. The work was becoming intuitive, flowing from someplace deeper than conscious thought. And I'd begun to understand what was missing from the Temporal Symphony. The final component, the piece that only I could make, was something Josephine called a temporal focuser. According to her notes, it was a kind of lens made not of glass but of specifically shaped and tuned metal, ground and polished to create resonances that would amplify and direct the temporal field generated by the rest of the clock. The problem was that no two temporal focusers could be the same. Each one had to be tailored to the specific temporal signature of the person who would use the clock. It was Josephine had written, like a fingerprint made of time itself, unique and unreplicable, which meant I couldn't follow instructions or copy a design. I had to feel my way through it, trusting my instincts and the gift I was still learning to control. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. ## Part 4. The Creation. March arrived with the first hints of spring. Snowdrops pushing through the last patches of snow, longer days, softer light. I marked my 6-month anniversary at Thornhaven by finally moving into the master bedroom, into Josephine's room, which Mrs. Crawford had kept pristine but empty. Felt right somehow, like I was stepping into a role I'd been preparing for all along. The room was beautiful. High ceilings, tall windows looking out over the sea, furniture that was elegant but comfortable. And on the mantelpiece, the silent clock, the one that had unnerved me when I first saw it. I wound it now using a key I found in the drawer of the bedside table. And as its hands began to move with that uncanny smoothness, I realized I could feel it. A subtle shift in the temporal field around it, like a stone creating ripples in still water. This clock, I understood, was Josephine's personal timepiece, attuned to her specific temporal signature. And now, with me in the room, with my own signature beginning to strengthen, the two patterns were interacting, creating harmonics I could sense but not yet fully interpret. It was like learning a new language where you could understand the emotional tone before you grasped the specific words. I began working on the temporal focuser in early April, as the gardens around Thornhaven burst into bloom. Mrs. Crawford had hired a local youth to help with the grounds, and I'd watch him from the tower windows, pruning and planting, bringing order back to what had grown wild during Josephine's final years. The focuser had to be made from an alloy of metals that Josephine had spent years perfecting: silver, copper, gold, and trace amounts of several others, melted together in precise ratios and under carefully controlled conditions. The metallurgy alone was daunting, requiring me to set up a small foundry in one corner of the workshop, complete with crucibles and temperature controls. I melted and remelted the metals dozens of times, testing each batch until I achieved the exact properties Josephine's notes specified. The alloy had to ring at a specific frequency when struck, had to conduct temporal energy, whatever that actually meant, in a particular way. And then came the shaping. The focuser was a disc about the size of my palm, but its surface wasn't flat. It had to be ground into a complex three-dimensional curve, a shape that existed in 4 dimensions if you counted time as a spatial axis. The mathematics were beyond me, but Josephine had left detailed drawings, and I had something better than math. I had instinct. I would work on the piece for hours, grinding and polishing, then stop and just hold it, feeling for the temporal resonances, sensing where material needed to be removed or where the curve wasn't quite right. It was painstaking, meditative work, and I fell into it completely, losing track of days and weeks. Mrs. Crawford brought my meals on trays, left them outside the tower door. She didn't disturb me, understanding that I'd entered that state of creative obsession where interruption felt like violence. The focuser began to take shape, literally and figuratively. I could see it in my mind's eye even when I wasn't working on it, could feel the way it needed to curve and spiral, could sense the resonances building as I got closer to the final form. And then, one morning in late May, I knew it was done. I held the disc up to the morning light, watching the way the metal seemed to shimmer with more than just reflected brightness. It was beautiful, like a piece of abstract sculpture, but it was also functional, purposeful. I could feel it humming in my hands, vibrating at frequencies that had nothing to do with sound. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle my ancestors had been working on for generations. My hands were shaking as I carried it to the Temporal Symphony, as I located the place where it needed to be installed, the very center of the mechanism, the point where all the gears and regulators and oscillators came together. Installing it required disassembling half the clock, carefully removing components I'd spent months studying, making sure I understood exactly how everything fit back together. Took me all day, working with painstaking care, checking and rechecking each connection. And finally, as sunset painted the tower walls gold and crimson, I installed the focuser, watching it slide into place with a soft click that sounded somehow final, somehow inevitable. The Temporal Symphony was complete. I stepped back, exhausted and exhilarated, and just looked at it. In the evening light, the crystal case seemed to glow from within, the metal components catching and reflecting light in ways that seemed impossible, that created patterns shifting and morphing as I watched. And then I realized it was already running. I hadn't wound it. I hadn't engaged any of the mechanisms. But the gears were turning, slowly, majestically, each one moving at its own pace, creating a visual symphony of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. The focuser at the center pulsed with a soft light, and I could feel it now, really feel it, the temporal field radiating outward from the clock, changing the very texture of the air in the tower. I moved closer, drawn by something I couldn't resist, and placed my hand on the crystal case. The world exploded. Not literally. There was no sound, no force, no physical sensation at all. But my perception shifted so dramatically that it felt like being torn apart and reassembled in an instant. Suddenly I could see time, not as a metaphor, not as an abstract concept, but as a real, tangible thing. A landscape that stretched out in all directions, past and future existing simultaneously, every moment connected to every other moment in an intricate web of causality and consequence. I saw my own timeline branching backward into the past. My arrival at Thornhaven, my life in the city before that, my childhood, my birth, my parents' lives, their parents' lives, generations upon generations stretching back like roots of an impossibly vast tree. And I saw the Temporal Symphony's history, Josephine working on it day after day, year after year. Her father before her, adding his contributions. His mother, my great-great-great-grandmother, designing the first components. On and on, each generation adding their piece to the puzzle. But more than that, I could see the why of it all. The Temporal Symphony wasn't just a clock. It was a window, a way of seeing time as it really was, stripped of the linear illusion humans normally experienced. And once you could see time as it really was, you could understand it. And understanding it meant you could potentially work with it rather than just be carried along by its current. The Thornes hadn't been trying to change history or alter fate. They'd been trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. And now, with the clock complete, with the focuser tuned to my specific temporal signature, I could see what they'd seen. I could understand what they'd understood. It was overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I saw possibilities branching forward, futures that might be, decisions unmade, paths not yet taken. I saw the consequences of choices, the ripple effects of actions, the way every moment influenced every other moment in an endless dance of cause and effect. And I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. There was a darkness in the temporal landscape, a distortion, a place where time itself seemed twisted, wrong. It was distant, not affecting Thornhaven or even the village, but it was growing, spreading, like a cancer in the fabric of reality itself. I pulled my hand away from the clock, gasping, and the vision faded. The tower snapped back into normal focus, the evening light suddenly seeming flat and dull after what I just witnessed. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the floor, my heart racing, my mind reeling. "Miss Evelyn?" Mrs. Crawford's voice from the stairway. I'd been so absorbed I hadn't heard her approach. "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice shook. "I'm fine." She appeared in the doorway, took one look at me, and quickly crossed the room. "You activated it." It wasn't a question. "I just touched it." I said. I didn't mean to. It's attuned to you now. The focuser recognized you. She helped me to my feet, guided me to a chair. What did you see? I tried to find words for it, but they all seemed inadequate. Everything, time as it really is, the past, the future, all of it connected. And I looked up at her. There's something wrong, something out there affecting time itself. It's like a wound in reality. Mrs. Crawford's expression grew grave. Your great-aunt saw it too, toward the end. She called it the temporal tear. She didn't know what caused it, but she was afraid it would grow, that eventually it would threaten everything. What is it? She believed it was artificial, something created, whether accidentally or deliberately, that disrupted the natural flow of time. A paradox made manifest. Mrs. Crawford moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sea. She thought that once the Temporal Symphony was complete, once someone with the gift strong enough could use it properly, they might be able to do something about it. Like what? How do you fix a tear in time? I don't know. She never got that far. Mrs. Crawford turned back to me. But she believed you would figure it out. That's why she left all this to you. Not just the house or the clocks or even the symphony itself. She left you the responsibility of protecting time itself. I stared at her, the weight of what she was saying settling over me like a heavy cloak. I'm just learning all this. I've only been here a few months. How am I supposed to? You'll learn, Mrs. Crawford said firmly. The same way you learned everything else. By studying, by practicing, by trusting your instincts. The Thornes have always risen to meet their responsibilities. You will too. I wanted to argue, to protest that this was too much, too big, too impossible. But looking at the Temporal Symphony, at this miraculous machine my ancestors had spent generations building, I realized she was right. This was my inheritance. Not just the house or the money, but the duty that came with the gift I'd been born with. I was a Thorne, a keeper of time, and there was work to be done. ## Part 5. The Understanding. Over the following weeks, I learned to use the Temporal Symphony properly. It wasn't just about touching it and experiencing visions. It was about learning to focus, to direct my perception, to navigate the temporal landscape with intention rather than being overwhelmed by it. It was exhausting work. Each session with the clock left me drained, sometimes to the point where I'd sleep for 12 hours straight afterward. But gradually I grew stronger, more adept, more comfortable with seeing time as it really was. I began to understand the patterns, the flows, the way temporal energy moved through the world. I learned to trace causality chains, to see how events in the past led to outcomes in the present, to predict, within limits, what might happen in the future. And I studied the temporal tear. It was located somewhere in Europe, I thought, though pinpointing exact geographic locations in the temporal landscape was difficult. It was a roiling mass of temporal distortion, a place where past, present, and future were all tangled together in a chaotic mess that grew larger each time I observed it. Josephine's journals had notes about it, observations she'd made over the years. She'd first detected it in the 1980s, a small anomaly she'd almost dismissed as an error in her perception. But over the decades, it had grown steadily larger, and her notes grew increasingly concerned. Her last entry about it, written just weeks before her death, was particularly ominous. The tear is accelerating. I can feel it now without even using the symphony, a wrongness in the temporal field, like nails on a chalkboard translated into time itself. I fear I've run out of time to address it myself. I can only hope that Evelyn proves strong enough, clever enough, to do what I could not. The world depends on it, whether the world knows it or not. No pressure, then. I threw myself into research, reading not just Josephine's journals but traveling to the village library, ordering books through interlibrary loan, even making a trip to London to visit the British Library and dig through their collections on horology, physics, and obscure temporal theory. The librarian at the British Library, a young woman named Sarah with bright eyes and a passion for obscure knowledge, became an unexpected ally. When I explained I was researching temporal anomalies for a novel I was writing, she lit up with enthusiasm. "Oh, that's fascinating. There's a whole subculture of theoretical physicists who've been writing about time-related phenomena for years. Most of it's considered fringe science, but some of the ideas are really compelling." She directed me to papers on closed time-like curves, on quantum temporal fluctuations, on the possibility of causality violations. None of it was quite what I was looking for. These were all theoretical constructs, mathematical abstractions, but they gave me vocabulary, gave me frameworks for thinking about what I was experiencing. And slowly, over summer and into autumn, a picture began to emerge. The temporal tier wasn't random. It had a source, a point of origin that I could trace backward through the temporal landscape. Something had happened, some event or experiment or accident that had created it. And if I could identify exactly what that was, I might be able to figure out how to undo it. The problem was that the event was shielded, somehow. When I tried to trace the causality chains back to their source, I hit a wall. Not a physical barrier, but a kind of temporal static, a noise that obscured my vision and made it impossible to see clearly. It was like trying to look through frosted glass. I could see shapes, hints of what lay beyond, but no clear details. I needed more power, more precision. The Temporal Symphony was extraordinary, but it had been designed for observation and understanding, not for active intervention. I needed to modify it, to add components that would let me pierce through that temporal static and see what was really there, which meant I needed to design something entirely new. I spent September sketching, calculating, experimenting. I built test mechanisms, small clockwork devices that incorporated elements of temporal focusing technology. Most failed in various spectacular ways. Gears seizing up, springs snapping, entire assemblies shaking themselves apart. But gradually, through trial and error and that intuitive sense I'd been developing, I figured it out. What I needed was a temporal amplifier, a device that could take the symphony signal and boost it, focusing temporal energy the way a laser focused light. It would be dangerous, potentially unstable, but if I could get it right, it might be exactly what I needed. I started building in October, marking the one-year anniversary of Josephine's death, by beginning the most complex piece of clockwork I'd ever attempted. The amplifier required components ground to tolerances of microns, gears cut with perfect precision, materials I had to special order from suppliers in Switzerland and Japan. Mrs. Crawford watched my obsession with concern but didn't interfere. She kept the house running, kept me fed, and occasionally reminded me to sleep. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said one evening, bringing dinner to the tower where I'd been working for 36 hours straight. "I don't have a choice," I replied, not looking up from the delicate gear I was filing. "The tier is growing faster. If I don't figure out how to stop it soon, it's been there for 40 years. Another few weeks won't make a difference. Won't it?" I set down the gear and rubbed my eyes. How do we know? How do we know there isn't some critical threshold where it grows beyond our ability to do anything about it? Mrs. Crawford was quiet for a moment. Your great-aunt worried about the same thing, consumed her final years. Don't let it consume you too. Someone has to do this. Yes, but not at the cost of your own health and sanity. She set down the tray firmly. Eat, rest. The Temporal Symphony will still be here tomorrow. I wanted to argue, but I was too tired. And she was right. I'd been pushing too hard, sleeping too little, neglecting everything except the work. I ate the dinner mechanically, tasting nothing, then let Mrs. Crawford lead me down to my bedroom. I fell asleep the moment my head hit the pillow, and I dreamed. I was standing in the temporal landscape, that four-dimensional space where time itself could be seen and navigated. But I wasn't alone. There was someone else there. A figure made of light and shadow, impossible to focus on clearly. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice echoing strangely. "A friend," the figure replied, and the voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it. Or perhaps a warning. "The path you're on is dangerous, Evelyn Thorne." "I know, but I don't have a choice." "There are always choices." The figure moved closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, old, wise, infinitely sad. "The temporal tier cannot be undone, can only be contained, or accepted." "Accepted? You mean just let it grow until it consumes everything?" "No, but perhaps you should ask yourself why it exists, what purpose it serves. Not all wounds are meant to be healed." "That doesn't make any sense." "Doesn't it?" The figure was fading now, becoming translucent. "Time is not meant to be perfect, Evelyn. It's meant to flow, to change, to break and mend itself. Your ancestors understood this. They built the Temporal Symphony to observe, not to control. Remember that." "Wait!" But the figure was gone, and I was falling, tumbling through layers of time, past and future blurring together, until I woke with a gasp in my darkened bedroom. The clock on the mantel showed 3:17 a.m. I lay there, heart racing, trying to make sense of the dream. It had felt too real to be just a dream, too purposeful. Had someone or something actually contacted me through the temporal field? And if so, what were they trying to tell me? Couldn't get back to sleep. I got up, wrapped myself in a dressing gown, and padded through the silent house to the tower. The Temporal Symphony sat in the moonlight, its crystal case gleaming, gears frozen in mid-motion. I approached it slowly, not touching it yet, just observing. And as I looked at it, really looked at it, I began to see what I'd been missing. The symphony was perfect in its own way, complete, functional. It didn't need the amplifier I'd been building. It needed me to understand how to use it properly, to work with time rather than trying to force time to work for me. The temporal tier wasn't an enemy to be defeated. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a wound that reflected some fundamental imbalance in the temporal field. And maybe, just maybe, it couldn't be fixed by force. It needed healing. And healing required understanding what had caused the injury in the first place. I sat down at my workbench, pulled out a fresh journal, and began to write. Not designs or calculations, but questions. What created the tier? Why had it appeared when it did? What had changed in the world, in the flow of time itself, to allow such a thing to exist? I worked through the night and into the morning, assembling everything I knew, looking for patterns, searching for the insight that would unlock the mystery. And as dawn broke over the sea, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I found it. ## Part 6. The Discovery. The temporal tier had appeared in 1984. Josephine's journals were clear on that point. One day it hadn't existed. The next day it had a small but definite distortion in the temporal field. 1984. The Cold War was still raging. Technology was advancing rapidly. The world was changing faster than it ever had before. But what specific event could have created a temporal anomaly? I went back to my research, this time looking not at physics or horology but at history. What had happened in 1984 that might have affected time itself? I made a list. Political events, scientific breakthroughs, technological innovations, disasters natural and man-made. The list was long and initially overwhelming. But as I studied the patterns, certain things began to stand out. 1984 was when the first truly powerful supercomputers came online, when genetic engineering started to become a practical reality, when the first tests of certain experimental technologies, things I'd barely heard of, began in earnest. And then I found it, buried in an obscure scientific journal I'd ordered from a university library, a paper about an experiment conducted at a particle accelerator in Switzerland, an attempt to create and observe certain quantum effects that had, according to the paper, unexpected results that remain under investigation. The dates matched. The location matched. When I consulted the Temporal Symphony, the tear's origin point was definitely in that region of Europe. This was it. This was what had created the temporal tear. But what exactly had they done? The paper was deliberately vague, couched in technical language that obscured more than it revealed. Clearly, whatever had happened had been significant enough to warrant secrecy. I needed more information. I needed to know exactly what that experiment had been, what had gone wrong, and whether there was any way to undo it. Which meant I needed to go to Switzerland. Mrs. Crawford took the news better than I'd expected. "How long will you be gone?" "I don't know. A few weeks, maybe longer. I need to visit this facility, see if I can access their records, figure out exactly what happened. And if they won't let you in?" I smiled grimly. "Then I'll have to be creative." She nodded slowly. "Your great-aunt would have done the same thing. She was never one to let obstacles stop her." She paused. "But be careful, Miss Evelyn. If what you suspect is true, if powerful people were involved in creating this tier, they might not want you digging into it." "I know. I'll be careful." I spent the next week preparing. I arranged for Mrs. Crawford to continue maintaining the house. I packed carefully clothes, documentation, and, most importantly, a small portable version of a temporal sensor I'd built, a device that would let me detect temporal anomalies without needing the full Temporal Symphony. And I studied everything I could find about the facility where the experiment had taken place, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, better known as CERN. I flew to Geneva in early November, 1 year after I'd first arrived at Thornhaven. The flight was long and uncomfortable, and I spent most of it studying my notes, preparing for what I might find. The facility itself was enormous, a sprawling campus of buildings surrounding a massive underground particle accelerator. Getting in was surprisingly easy. I simply posed as a science journalist writing a piece about the history of the facility. The public relations office set me up with a tour and access to their historical archives. I spent 3 days combing through files, looking for anything related to that 1984 experiment. Most of what I found was routine test results, maintenance logs, budget reports. But on the 4th day, I found a file marked Incident Report 84-23, classified. It was locked in a secure archive, accessible only with special permission. But I'd been learning to work with locks, both physical and temporal, and late one evening, when the archives were closed, I let myself in. The file was thin, just a dozen pages, but they were explosive. In March of 1984, CERN had been conducting an experiment designed to create and observe certain exotic particles. The experiment had involved smashing particles together at unprecedented energies, trying to see what emerged from the collisions. Something had gone wrong. The energies had spiked beyond expected levels. There had been a brief moment, nanoseconds, according to the instruments, when the fundamental forces of nature had seemed to uncouple, when the laws of physics themselves had flickered and nearly failed. And in that moment, they'd created something. A stable microsingularity, the report called it, though the author noted that term was imprecise. It was a point of infinite density of compressed spacetime that hadn't evaporated as theory predicted it should. Instead, it had persisted, growing slowly but steadily, feeding on the quantum vacuum energy that permeated all of space. And because it was a singularity in spacetime, it affected not just space but time. It created ripples, distortions, anomalies that propagated outward from the point of creation. The temporal tier. The report concluded with a recommendation that the facility be immediately shut down and the singularity contained or neutralized. But there was a handwritten note in the margin, dated several months later. Project continuation authorized. Singularity remains stable and containable. Risk assessment acceptable. Someone had decided to leave it there, to let the temporal tear grow year after year, because shutting it down would have meant admitting they'd made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. I photographed the entire file with trembling hands, my mind racing. This was it. This was the proof I needed. But more than that, it gave me information about the nature of the tear, about what sustained it. If it was feeding on quantum vacuum energy, then disrupting that energy flow might starve it, might cause it to collapse back in on itself. But how did you disrupt something that fundamental to the structure of reality itself? I needed help. Professional help from someone who understood the physics at a level I never could. I thought of Sarah, the librarian in London who'd been so enthusiastic about temporal theory. She'd mentioned knowing theoretical physicists working on fringe ideas. Maybe one of them could help me figure out what to do with the information I'd discovered. I left Switzerland the next day, taking the file photographs with me, and headed to London. Sarah was surprised to see me but welcomed me warmly. "Evelyn, I didn't expect you back so soon. How's the novel coming?" "It's complicated," I said. "Listen, those physicists you mentioned, the ones working on temporal theory, do you think any of them would be willing to talk to me? It's important." She studied my face, and I saw the moment she realized I wasn't writing fiction. "What have you gotten yourself into?" "Something bigger than I expected." I lowered my voice. "Please, I need help from someone who understands particle physics and temporal theory at a professional level. Someone who can keep a secret." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "There's someone, a friend from university. She got pushed out of mainstream academia because her theories were too unconventional, but she's brilliant. If anyone can help you, it's her. Can you set up a meeting? I'll call her tonight." 2 days later, I found myself in a cluttered flat in Camden, sitting across from Dr. Maya Patel, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained intellectual energy. I showed her the photographs from the CERN file. I told her about the temporal tier, about the Temporal Symphony, about everything I'd discovered over the past year. And I waited for her to tell me I was insane. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and laughed. Not mockingly, but with genuine delight. "I knew it. I knew something like this had to exist. Do you have any idea how many years I've been arguing that consciousness can perceive temporal fields directly? That time is more plastic than standard physics admits." She leaned forward, eyes bright. "And you're telling me your family has been studying this for centuries?" "Yes, and now I need help figuring out how to fix what CERN broke." Her excitement dimmed slightly. "That's significantly more challenging. If what this report says is true, they've created a stable violation of causality. That shouldn't be possible, but apparently it is. And once you've broken the laws of physics in one place, the break tends to propagate. So it can't be fixed?" "I didn't say that." Maya started pulling books off her shelves, stacking them on her desk. "But it's going to require some very creative thinking. We need to figure out a way to collapse the singularity without causing an even bigger temporal catastrophe in the process. How long will that take? How long do we have?" I thought about my latest observations of the tier, about how much it had grown in just the past few months. "Not long. Months, maybe. A year at most before it becomes critical." Maya nodded grimly. "Then we'd better get started. ### part 7. the solution. We worked through November and into December. The three of us, Maya, Sarah, who'd insisted on helping despite having no physics background, and me. Maya's flat became our command center, walls covered with equations and diagrams, her whiteboard filled with calculations that got more complex by the day. The problem was deceptively simple. We needed to collapse a stable singularity without knowing exactly what was keeping it stable. The CERN file had given us valuable information, but it was incomplete, written by people who'd been trying to cover up their mistake rather than analyze it properly. Maya developed several theoretical approaches. The most promising involved creating a carefully tuned pulse of energy that would interfere with the quantum vacuum fluctuations feeding the singularity. Think of it as noise-canceling headphones for reality itself. If we could generate a signal that was perfectly out of phase with the fluctuations, they'd cancel each other out, and the singularity would collapse. The catch was that the pulse needed to be precise to an absurd degree. Errors of less than a microsecond would cause the whole thing to fail. And it needed to be generated at exactly the right point in space-time, which meant I'd need to use the Temporal Symphony to identify that point and then somehow project the pulse across hundreds of miles. "This is impossible," I said one evening after a particularly frustrating session. "Difficult," Maya corrected. "Not impossible. Difficult. How am I supposed to generate this pulse? I'm a clockmaker, not a particle physicist." "You're more than a clockmaker," Sarah said quietly. "You're someone who can see and work with time directly. That's a power, Maya, and I can only dream about." Maya nodded. "She's right. The math says this should work, but it requires someone who can perceive temporal fields to guide it. Your Temporal Symphony gives you the perception. We just need to figure out how to give you the power." I thought about the amplifier I'd started building and then abandoned. Maybe I'd been on the right track after all, not to pierce through the temporal static, but to generate the pulse we needed. "I might have something," I said slowly, "back at Thornhaven, a device I was working on. If I modified it according to your specifications, then we might actually have a chance." Maya pulled up her calculations on her laptop. "Let me show you exactly what frequencies we need." I returned to Thornhaven a week before Christmas, my head spinning with equations and specifications. Mrs. Crawford greeted me with visible relief. "Thank God you're back. The house has been too quiet without you." "I've figured out how to fix it," I said. "The temporal tear. I know what caused it and how to collapse it. But I need to build something new. Something that will let me project temporal energy precisely over long distances." "How long do you have?" "Not long. The tear is growing exponentially now. If we don't act within the next few months, it might become impossible to stop." I threw myself into the work with renewed purpose. The device I needed, Maya had called it a temporal coherence projector, was part amplifier, part focusing lens, part transmitter. It would take the Temporal Symphony signal and boost it, then direct it with precision to the exact location and time where the singularity existed. The components required were exotic and expensive. I spent thousands of pounds on specialty alloys, on crystals ground to precise specifications, on electronics so advanced they bordered on experimental. The money Josephine had left me was quickly depleted, but I didn't care. This was what it was for. This was why she'd preserved the estate and left it to me. January passed in a blur of work. I barely left the tower except to eat and sleep. My hands grew calloused from handling tools. My eyes ached from peering at tiny components under magnification. But piece by piece, the temporal coherence projector took shape. By February, I was ready to test it. I connected it to the Temporal Symphony, watching as the two devices interfaced, their temporal fields harmonizing and amplifying each other. The tower hummed with energy I could feel in my bones, and when I activated the full system, the air seemed to shimmer, reality itself rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I could see the temporal tier now, clearer than ever before, not just as a distant distortion but in precise detail. I could see the singularity at its heart, that impossible point of compressed spacetime, and I could trace the quantum vacuum fluctuations feeding into it. And I could see the solution, the exact frequency and timing of the pulse I needed to generate to collapse it. It would work. Maya's calculations were correct. I could feel it in my bones, that intuitive certainty that had guided me throughout this journey. But there was a problem. The pulse required more energy than I could generate safely. The temporal coherence projector would burn out after a single use, maybe taking part of the temporal symphony with it. And there was a risk, a small but non-zero risk, that collapsing the singularity might create a backlash, a temporal shockwave that could propagate backward through time and cause unpredictable effects. I called Maya and told her what I'd found. "How bad could the backlash be?" she asked. "I don't know. Worst case, it could erase the last 40 years, reset reality to a state before the singularity was created. Best case? Just local effects, maybe some memories feeling wrong, some histories that don't quite line up. That's a hell of a gamble." "I know, but if we don't do anything, the tier will eventually grow large enough to tear apart causality completely. We're talking about the potential end of time as a coherent phenomenon." Maya was quiet for a long moment. "Then we don't really have a choice, do we?" "No," I agreed. "We don't. When are you going to do it?" "Soon. I need to wait for the right temporal alignment. There's a point coming up in 3 weeks where the quantum fields will be naturally more stable, which should minimize the risk of backlash." March 15th, at exactly 11:47 p.m. "The Ides of March," Maya said with dark humor. "How appropriate. Evelyn." "Yes. Good luck. And thank you for doing this, for having the courage to see it through. Thank you for helping me understand it. I couldn't have done this without you." After I hung up, I sat in the tower for a long time, just looking at the machines I'd built, thinking about what I was about to do. There was real risk here, not just to the equipment but to reality itself, to the timeline, to history. But Josephine had been right to trust me with this. The Thornes had always been keepers of time, protectors of temporal integrity. This was my responsibility, my purpose. Everything I'd learned, everything I'd built, had been leading to this moment. I spent the next 3 weeks in preparation. I checked and rechecked every component of the temporal coherence projector. I ran simulations using the Temporal Symphony, making sure I understood exactly what would happen when I generated the pulse. I wrote detailed notes about the process, about the theory behind it, about what I'd learned, so that if something went wrong, someone else might be able to learn from my work. And I said my goodbyes. Not explicitly, I didn't want to alarm anyone. But I spent time with Mrs. Crawford, thanking her for her patience and support. I called my mother, something I hadn't done in months, and just talked with her about nothing important, letting her know in subtle ways that I loved her. And I wrote letters to Maya, to Sarah, to Mr. Blackwood, to be opened if I didn't survive the attempt or if the backlash was worse than expected. March 15th arrived with unseasonably warm weather, spring arriving early to the coast. I spent the day in calm preparation, going through my checklist, making sure everything was ready. Mrs. Crawford knew something significant was happening, though I hadn't told her the details. "Will you be all right?" she asked over an early dinner. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "One way or another, this ends tonight." She nodded, accepting this. "Your great-aunt would be proud of you. You've become everything she hoped you would be." "I hope so." At 11 p.m., I climbed to the tower one last time. The Temporal Symphony and the Temporal Coherence projector sat ready, their combined temporal field already active, humming with potential energy. I had 47 minutes to make final preparations, to center myself, to gather my courage for what I was about to do. I spent the time in meditation, feeling the temporal currents around me, sensing the rhythm of time itself. And gradually, I felt my consciousness expand, reaching out beyond the tower, beyond Thornhaven, across the miles to where the temporal tier pulsed and writhed at the heart of Europe. 11:47 p.m. approached. I moved to the controls, my hands steady despite my racing heart. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. At exactly 11 hours and 47 minutes, I activated the temporal coherence projector. The world turned inside out. Energy flooded through the system, through me, channeled by my will and my gift into a precise, focused pulse of temporal force. I could see it lance across the distance, could feel it strike the singularity at the heart of the temporal tier. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the singularity began to oscillate, its stable configuration disrupted by the carefully tuned interference pattern. It flickered, wavered, and began to collapse. But as it collapsed, it released energy, decades worth of accumulated temporal distortion, releasing all at once in a shockwave that rippled outward through time itself. I felt it hit me, felt it tear through my consciousness like a hurricane, and suddenly I was falling through layers of time, past and present and future all blurring together, memories that weren't mine flooding through my mind, histories that hadn't happened and futures that wouldn't happen all colliding in an impossible chaos of temporal information. I saw myself as a child, as a teenager, as the woman I might have become if I'd never come to Thornhaven. I saw Josephine young and vibrant, working alongside her father in this very tower. I saw the Thorns stretching back through generations, each one adding their piece to the puzzle, each one understanding that they were building toward this moment. And I saw the temporal tier collapse, the singularity winking out of existence, the wound in reality finally healing. But the cost, the temporal shockwave was propagating backward, affecting the timeline, changing things in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. Not major changes. The core of history seemed intact, but small shifts, subtle alterations, like ripples spreading across a pond. I tried to hold on, tried to maintain my sense of self as reality rewrote itself around me, but it was too much, too overwhelming. My consciousness fragmented, scattered across multiple timelines, and I felt myself coming apart. And then something caught me, a presence in the temporal storm, familiar and strong. I felt arms around me. Not physical arms, but something deeper, a temporal embrace that held me together even as the world shifted and reformed. "Easy," a voice said, Josephine's voice. "I've got you. Hold on just a little longer." "You're dead," I managed to think. "Death is just another kind of time," she replied, and I could feel her smile even though I couldn't see her. "And we Thorns have always had a complicated relationship with time. You did it, Evelyn. You closed the tier. You saved the timeline. Now you just have to survive it." The shockwave peaked, reality shuddering like a bell struck too hard, and then gradually it began to settle. The chaos resolved into order. The fragments of my consciousness coalesced back into a single, coherent self. And I found myself on the floor of the tower, gasping for breath, my body aching like I'd run a marathon. But alive, still alive. I lay there for a long time, just breathing, feeling time flowing around me in its normal, stable patterns. The temporal tier was gone. I could feel its absence like the relief of a toothache finally ending. It was over. I'd done it. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet and checked the equipment. The temporal coherence projector was smoking ruin. Its components fused and melted beyond any hope of repair. And the Temporal Symphony itself had suffered damage. Several gears were frozen. The crystal case had a hairline crack running through it. but it had survived. Broken, yes, but not destroyed. Could be repaired, given time and patience. I made my way downstairs on shaking legs. Mrs. Crawford was waiting in the entrance hall, her face pale. What happened? The whole house shook. All the clocks stopped at once. I looked around and realized she was right. Every clock in Thornhaven had stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m. Their hands frozen in place, their ticking silenced. "I'll explain everything," I said. "But first, I need you to do something for me. Wind that clock." I pointed to a grandfather clock by the stairs, one of Josephine's earliest creations. Mrs. Crawford moved to it hesitantly and opened its case, reaching for the key. She wound it, and its pendulum began to swing. Its ticking resumed, steady and sure. And as it began to keep time again, the other clocks in the house slowly came back to life. First one, then another, then all of them at once. A symphony of ticking that filled the house with sound. Time was flowing properly again. The timeline had stabilized. I started laughing, relief and exhaustion and triumph all mixed together, and Mrs. Crawford caught me as my legs finally gave out completely. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you to bed. You can tell me everything in the morning." "I closed it," I murmured as she helped me toward the stairs. "The temporal tier. It's gone. Time is safe." "I know," she said softly. "I know. Josephine would be so proud." ## Part 8. The Aftermath. I slept for 3 days straight. When I finally woke, it was to afternoon sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and the smell of Mrs. Crawford's cooking wafting up from the kitchen. I felt like I'd been taken apart and put back together slightly wrong. Not damaged, exactly, but different, changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. I made my way downstairs carefully, my body still weak, and found Mrs. Crawford in the kitchen preparing tea. "Welcome back," she said. "I was starting to worry you'd sleep through the spring." "What day is it?" "March 19th. You've been unconscious for 72 hours. I checked on you regularly. You were breathing, your pulse was steady, but you wouldn't wake up. I almost called for a doctor several times. I'm glad you didn't." I accepted the cup of tea she offered. "They wouldn't have understood what happened." "And what did happen exactly?" I told her everything about CERN, about the singularity, about Maya's calculations and the temporal coherence projector and the pulse that had finally collapsed the temporal tier. I told her about the temporal shockwave and the sensation of reality rewriting itself, about Josephine's presence catching me and holding me together. Mrs. Crawford listened without interrupting, her expression grave. "Did it change things?" she asked when I was finished. "The shockwave, did it alter the timeline?" "Yes," I admitted, "but only in small ways, I think. The core of history seems intact, but there might be details that are different now, memories that don't quite match, events that unfolded slightly differently than they did before. It's hard to explain." "I feel it," Mrs. Crawford said slowly, "like déjà vu but reversed. Like things are familiar, but not quite the same as I remember." "That will fade," I said, hoping I was right. "As the timeline fully stabilizes, as cause and effect reestablish their proper relationships. Give it a few weeks." Over the following days, I slowly returned to normal functioning. I ate properly, slept on a regular schedule, took walks along the cliffs to rebuild my strength. And I began the work of repairing the Temporal Symphony. The damage was significant but not irreparable. I spent hours carefully removing broken components, filing new gears, grinding a patch for the crack in the crystal case. It was meditative work, peaceful after the intensity of recent months. And as I worked, I felt myself changing. The gift had always been there, but now it was stronger, more refined. I could sense temporal currents with precision I'd never imagined. I could feel the flow of time around me, through me as natural as breathing. I was no longer just learning to be a thorn. I had become one, fully and completely. In early April, Maya called. "Are you all right?" she asked immediately. "I've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm fine." It worked. Maya, the temporal tear is gone. I can't sense it anymore. I know. I can feel it too, or rather, I can feel its absence. It's like a weight I didn't know I was carrying has been lifted. She paused. But something's different. I have memories that don't quite fit together. Details that seem wrong. The temporal shockwave, I explained. It propagated backward through the timeline and caused minor changes. Nothing catastrophic, just small shifts. They should stabilize soon. Jesus, Maya Briatid. You actually did it. You changed history. Not changed, I corrected gently. Healed. There's a difference. We talked for over an hour, comparing notes, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Maya promised to write up the theoretical framework we'd developed, though she'd have to be careful about how she presented it. The world wasn't ready for proof that time could be manipulated. After I hung up, I sat in the tower for a long time, just thinking. I'd accomplished what Josephine had wanted. I'd completed the Temporal Symphony, learned to use my gift, and saved the timeline from a threat most people didn't even know existed. But now what? What did I do with the rest of my life? The answer came to me gradually, over the following weeks as spring deepened into early summer. I would continue Josephine's work, not just repairing clocks but studying time itself, understanding its nature, protecting it from future threats. The temporal tear had been created by accident, by people who didn't understand what they were dealing with. But there would be other threats, other dangers, as humanity's technology advanced and its ability to affect fundamental reality grew. Someone needed to watch for those dangers. Someone needed to be ready to act when necessary. And I was uniquely qualified for the role. I began planning in earnest. I would need to establish a network of contacts, physicists like Maya, historians, engineers, people who could help monitor for temporal anomalies. I'd need to continue developing my skills, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with clockwork and temporal manipulation. And I'd need to think about succession. I was only 32. I hopefully had decades ahead of me, but eventually, I'd need to pass the responsibility to someone else, just as Josephine had passed it to me. The one-year deadline from the will came and went without fanfare. I could have sold Thornhaven if I'd wanted to, taken the money and left. But the thought never seriously crossed my mind. This house, this workshop, this responsibility, they were mine now. Not as a burden, but as a purpose. In June, I received a letter from Mr. Blackwood's office. It was brief and formal, noting that the terms of the will had been fulfilled and that the estate was now unencumbered, mine to do with as I pleased. There was a postscript in what I recognized as Mr. Blackwood's own handwriting. Asterisk, your great-aunt would be proud of what you've accomplished. She knew you were special, even when you were just a child. I hope you'll continue her legacy. Asterisk. I smiled and filed the letter away. Then I climbed to the tower and got back to work. The Temporal Symphony was nearly repaired. Just a few more weeks of careful work, and it would be fully functional again. And then I could begin the next phase, not just observation but active monitoring, keeping watch over the temporal landscape for any signs of new disturbances. As I worked, I found myself humming, the same haunting melody from the music box Josephine had given me all those years ago. I'd never forgotten it, though I hadn't thought about it in decades. Now I understood what it was. Not just a pretty tune, but a temporal harmonic, a frequency that resonated with the natural flow of time itself. She'd been introducing me to my inheritance even then, planting seeds that would only sprout years later. I finished the gear I was working on and held it up to the light, checking its teeth for any imperfections. Finding none, I added it to the growing collection of replacement components. The afternoon sun slanted through the tower windows, painting everything in shades of gold. Outside, gulls cried and waves crashed against the cliffs below. The house around me ticked with the sound of dozens of clocks, each one keeping its own perfect time. I was home, not just in Thornhaven, but in this life, this purpose, this understanding of who I was and what I was meant to do. I was Evelyn Thorne, keeper of time, guardian of the temporal flow. And I had work to do. ## epilogue. 5 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, just like the one that had changed my life 5 years before. But this time I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting it, in fact. I'd sensed the temporal ripples, felt the shifts in probability that indicated something significant was about to happen. I opened it at my workbench in the tower, where I'd been adjusting a particularly intricate chronometer. Dear Miss Thorne, my name is James Chun. You don't know me, but I believe we may have something in common. I've recently discovered that I can sense time in ways others cannot, feel its flow, perceive its variations, sometimes even predict when things will happen with uncanny accuracy. My grandmother told me about your family before she died. She said the Thornes had a gift, and that if I ever manifested it myself, I should reach out to you. She said you would understand. I'm not sure what's happening to me. Sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy. But if there's even a chance that you can help me understand this, I need to try. Please, if you're willing to speak with me, contact me at the number below. Yours hopefully, James Chin. I read the letter twice, then set it down and looked out at the sea. Somewhere out there was a young person going through what I'd gone through. Confusion, fear, wonder. Not understanding the gift they'd been born with. And I could help them. I could teach them what Josephine had taught me. Share the knowledge accumulated over generations of thorns. Maybe even train them to continue the work of protecting time itself. The thought filled me with something like joy. I wasn't alone. The gift hadn't died with me. There were others out there, waiting to be found, waiting to understand what they were capable of. I picked up my phone and dialed the number from the letter. It rang twice before a young voice answered, nervous and hopeful. Hello, James? This is Evelyn Thorne. I got your letter. I smiled. Yes, I can help you. And yes, you're going to be just fine. In fact, you're going to be extraordinary. When can you come to Thornhaven? As I listened to his stammered response, making plans for his visit, I glanced at the Temporal Symphony. It sat in its place of honor, fully repaired and functioning perfectly, its crystal case gleaming in the afternoon light. The work continued, the legacy continued, and time flowed on, steady and sure, watched over by those of us who could see it clearly. Outside, the clocks of Thornhaven ticked in their endless symphony, marking the passage of moments into hours, hours into days, days into the vast river of time itself. And I stood at my post, keeper and guardian, ready for whatever came next. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But that was the beauty of time. Its infinite possibility, its endless potential for wonder and surprise. I was ready for it. Whatever it brought, I would face it as my ancestors had, with courage, with skill, and with the deep understanding that time was not something to be feared or controlled, but something to be respected, protected, and, when necessary, healed. The clockmaker's daughter had become the keeper of time itself. And the story was just beginning, the end.